My name is Emily Grace Mercer. I'm 38 years old. I live in a small split-level house in Cleveland, Ohio, on a street where the maple trees are too old to remember most of us, and snow piles up like a promise we didn't want. For most of the last decade I've been mobile, moving between apartments, jobs, crammed cars, and the kind of relationships that teach you to keep the door unlocked but your heart guarded. Right now, my life is frayed and stitched together. Recently divorced, sleeping in a rented room above a bakery, juggling freelance editing work with late-night shifts at a community center. My mother, Linda, has been my anchor and my problem all at once. Her memory failing, the small betrayals of dementia compounding 20 years of silence. I drove out here because she'd had a stroke in the hospital 3 days ago and they were discharging her into my care. I told myself it was the right thing. Before I dive in, if you listen to these kinds of stories and they mean anything to you, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, and I can't tell you how much it helps to know someone's there when the hours get long. The hospital smelled like bleach and coffee. Sharp, antiseptic, the kind of smell that presses against your sinuses until your own body becomes a sterile room. My mother lay still under a thin blue blanket when I found her awake, the left side of her mouth pulling like rope. She tried to joke. The joke fell out like a stone. We signed the forms. I practiced being the adult who makes decisions they don't have time to practice for. The nurses were kind in the blunt, efficient way of people who have watched too many families break and glue themselves back together again. I was given instructions, a list of pills, warnings about mobility, and a pamphlet with a hospital logo smiling in the corner. Driving home with her in the passenger seat was like carrying a syllabus for life that had changed mid-semester. She kept pressing her palm to the window and asking if we'd stop for ice cream the way she used to when I was small. The city looked the same, brownstone and brick, a busker playing the same sorrowful sax near the bridge, but everything felt rearranged by the knowledge that home now meant responsibility. When we pulled into the driveway of my parents' house, our parents' house, I watched my mother study the porch light with slow suspicion, like it might be a riddle. The house had been mostly empty since Dad died 5 years ago. The dining room table still held a dark ring where a pot had sat, the wallpaper had faded to saintly shades of beige. My brother Daniel, who had last been present in my life in fits and starts, texted that he'd be around later. That vague promise used to lull me. It didn't anymore. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and lemon oil. My mother's attempts at cleanliness in the face of everything else grinding down. She needed help climbing the stairs. I offered my arm and she gripped it like someone clinging to a cliff. We settled her in the living room with a pile of pillows and the TV set on a nature documentary no one was watching. She fell into a soft sleep with the blanket tucked up to her chin. I made the bed in the small guest room, and then the two of us sat there in the humming silence of post-hospital life. "You always pack too light," my mother told me at one point, a comment that broke me, the absurd normalcy of criticism keeping its teeth. I found myself apologizing for how long it had taken for me to be the person who answered the phone, and she shrugged as if I could fold time and mend the old seams with that apology. But old seams don't mend. They fray. I took a shower because some small piece of me believed cleanliness could buy mercy. The water hit my neck. I stood under it and imagined the stream carrying away the aloneness. I remember thinking, while lathering my hair, that maybe things could be manageable. The city was gray that afternoon, a soft rain pressing at the windows, the kind of weather that makes you move slowly on purpose. I cooked a very practical dinner: chicken, rice, Brussels sprouts, because routine is a net when everything else is falling. We ate in near silence, trading the kind of glances that don't have words but carry a volume. Exhaustion, relief, terror. I was thinking of everything and nothing when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. "Got your message. I took care of the lawn. Be there soon." No mention of his voice. No sign in the words of the man who'd left home at 22 with a suitcase full of anger and a head full of music. No sign, either, of the years in between where calls went unanswered or showed up as missed before he slipped back into my life like a bruise. I cleaned the dishes with a focus that bordered on frantic. My hands trembled a little when I rinsed the plates. Maybe nerves, maybe the sudden recollection of the shower scene in my father's old kitchen, when doors were slammed and someone learned to make peace by staying silent. After the dishes were done and the living room lights dimmed, I carried my mother's pills over and arranged them like a small, fragile geometry on the coffee table. She was asleep. The evening cooled. I thought of the hospital bed, the handwriting on the forms, the nurse's quiet practical voice saying, "If you need anything, don't hesitate. And if it gets to be too much, call us." Call us. As if there was ever a number that could actually take back the years. I sat down in an armchair, and my mind began to do what it always does. Rewind, forward, stitch in imaginary endings. I thought about my old bedroom, now empty, and about the birthday cake I'd left on the counter 5 houses and 3 marriages ago. Somewhere in the house an old grandfather clock ticked like a conscience. Then, just as the rain paused and the house inhaled, I heard it. A loud, hollow banging. Came from below. Not the pipes, not the radiator. Something metal, timed and full of a panic that didn't sound like anything but effort. My first thought was practical. Maybe Daniel was moving something heavy, maybe he was closing a trunk. My second thought was the nervous tickle behind my ribs. The kind that announces you are stepping into a memory you pretended to forget. For a second everything was still. My mother's breathing made a small, animal rhythm on the couch. The TV droned on about migration patterns. The banging came again. 3 sharp, patient hits, like someone pounding on the underside of the world. A chill moved through me, the kind I couldn't warm with a blanket. Instinct told me to go down and look. Curiosity told me to call out. Fear told me to freeze. "Daniel!" I called because it was the only name that made sense. My voice seemed small in the room, as if it belonged to someone else. No answer. The banging happened again, closer, like it was right under the floorboards. This time it reverberated through the chair I sat in, through my teeth. I could feel it under my soles, a thudding that tapped at a place inside me that had been taught to flinch. I stood up. For a moment the rational adult tried to map the possibilities. Runaway dishwasher, neighbor's renovation, a storm shifting a gutter. But the sound was coming from our house. The house where we had kept secrets. The house where my father had shouted and slammed doors, and where Daniel once had been small enough to hide under the stairs when things went bad. The house where I had promised myself I'd never come back to needing anyone. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I'm telling this because I think someone out there might be holding a similar breath. I told myself to breathe. I moved toward the hallway that led to the basement door, the floor creaking in ways that seemed to know all my stories. My hands were not steady, nor were my steps. The smell that greeted me when I opened the basement door was a mash of damp stone, oil, and an undercurrent of old cigarettes. Smell I hadn't noticed much since I was a child, when adult smells seemed like the normal weather of a home. The stairs were steep. The light bulb above the workbench flickered when I turned the switch. The basement was smaller than my imagination wanted it to be, lined with shelves of jars, a rusting furnace, a pile of my father's old magazines. And there, in the dim, something moved. I could see a silhouette hunched near the back wall beside a stack of cardboard boxes. He banged again, this time not on metal, but with the flat of his hand against a wooden crate. The sound ricocheted off the concrete and landed in my chest like a hand deal. It was Daniel. He didn't look like a ghost. He looked like someone who had been blowing in and out of the house for years and had finally anchored himself under the floor where nobody would have to explain much. He had a towel on his shoulder, a beer can in a dented box. He smelled like rain and whiskey and the roadside. His face was thinner. His hair had grown out and been cut with impatience. For a second we just stared at each other, 2 people inventing how to be in the same room without taking the weight of history with them. "Emily," he said, as if the name was a key that would open something. "You're early." "You're here," I replied. The sentence carrying more than most lines of dialogue seemed allowed to hold. "Are you living down here?" Daniel's laugh was short and a little broken. "What do you think? The rent's cheaper. Mom's got the upstairs. Bosses don't ask questions. It's fine." He sounded like someone repeating a script he'd used 100 times so he'd believe it. But the banging, his anger or his panic, had a specific cadence that suggested it wasn't just frustration. The boxes by his feet were stacked like a small ritual. His eyes kept flicking to a particular one on top, a thin shoebox with duct tape along the seam. The tape was half lifted, and something in the way he touched it made the air between us crack. "How long?" I asked. It was a simple question, but it felt like the first honest one I'd asked in a long time. He shrugged. "Months. You know, stuff." I could feel the old script trying to take hold. The one that says we can each have our pain neatly parceled and leave the other alone. But the banging had already called us into a scene that wouldn't let us go. And when Daniel looked up, when his eyes finally met mine, I saw something in him that I hadn't seen in the years he'd been away. A raw, recent hurt that wasn't going to be ignored. "Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends," I said, because even as my voice trembled, some part of me knew I was turning a private rupture into a public conversation. I didn't yet know whether that was brave or a betrayal. What I did know was this. The basement was full of noise now, and for reasons beyond moving boxes, something that had been locked away wanted out. I took one step down into the basement, and the cold hit me like the open mouth of a winter wind. The concrete floor did not try to be forgiving. The light above the workbench hummed with a lazy halo. Daniel was crouched with his hands on the shoebox, as if he were holding a sleeping animal. He looked almost apologetic. The shoebox had been where Dad had kept some of his small trophies, or maybe Dad's old letters. I couldn't tell. My hands, still full of the day's small practicalities, my mother's pill tray, the evening's dishes, felt suddenly too clean to touch what needed touching. "You could have told me," I said. It was not a question. It was the shape of a complaint that had been living in me for years, an accusation folded into a plea. In my mouth it tasted like rust. Daniel looked up without flinching. "Told you what? That I'm a mess. That I can't keep a job. Who would listen, Emily?" His voice didn't climb. It was steady in a way that made me realize this was exhaustion talking the loudest. He rubbed his forehead and then turned back to the box, fingers lingering on the scar of tape. The basement smelled stronger as I stepped closer. Dampness, damp cardboard, and something faintly sweet that might have been perfume or spilled coffee long ago. There were stacks of other boxes. Holiday decorations, a stack of my father's old sweaters, a dented guitar case. I remembered the way Daniel used to play. His hands big and quick, pulling out rhythms like they were secrets. He used to write songs as if composing an apology to a family that never asked for one. "Why are you here?" asked softer. Because the truth was that I needed to know whether he was escaping or collapsing or hiding from something deeper. I needed to know if the pounding had been a call for help or something worse. Daniel's laugh this time was more of a sound that hurt to make. "Maybe I'm tired of being invisible," he said. "Maybe I wanted a place to sleep that wasn't under a bridge. Maybe I didn't want to smell like the motel room on the interstate anymore. God, I wanted to be here when Mom needed someone." I sat down on a low crate opposite him because my body didn't know what else to do. My hands moved in my lap as if they were performing an old habit. Neat, contained, effective. "You could have called," I said. The sentence was clumsy but intended to matter. "I tried," he said. "I called. You didn't pick up. You were always busy. Always doing the noble thing somewhere else." There was anger now, edged in the way someone hits a vein when they try to make it bleed clean. I felt the old wound open. All the years I had been busy, the choices I had made that had been survival and selfishness at once. I remembered leaving home at 20 when Dad's fists had rewritten the rules of safety, and staying had meant learning to live in the middle of a war. I had thought leaving would be a kind of salvation. It had also been abandonment, and Daniel had paid the toll. He pulled the lid off the shoebox with a motion that had the grace of muscle memory. Inside were envelopes, brittle and yellow, tied with a string, alongside an old cassette tape with a label in my mother's handwriting. "Records, April 1992. My breath left me, a small, unavoidable sound. Letters. Evidence. Small things that construct the truth. "What's that?" I asked, though my hands wanted to reach into the shoebox and read the spines of our history like an emergency map. Daniel's jaw worked. Look. I picked up the top envelope. For a second my name might as well have been stamped on it. I slid it open and pulled out the paper. It was my mother's handwriting, the letters she used when she was trying to make sense of her own choices. Apologies woven with justifications, confessions half-made and then retracted in the same breath. There were admissions about Dad's temper, references to nights where she turned the other way and kept the children safe by hiding them. There was a paragraph that made my stomach drop like a stone. A line where she wrote, in careful, ashamed script, that she had seen something happen to Daniel when he was 9 and that she had not stopped it. My fingers trembled so badly that the edges of the letter blurred. The basement seemed to close in, the sound of the furnace taking on the timbre of a watchman breathing. I remembered, Daniel said, voices thin. I kept it here because I didn't want to believe it, because I wanted to believe we were just battered by Dad's temper and that was all. But then I found this, and it said things I didn't know how to. I can't tell you how to feel about it. I don't know how to feel about it. I just know this. I couldn't stand the thought of Mom thinking she didn't know. Do you think? I stopped. The idea that my mother had known in some way, and that she had made a choice to stay, to protect the home for reasons that were not brave but strategic. This felt like a betrayal and a revelation at the same time. The letters weren't clear in the way we want confessions to be. They were full of hedges and pain, admissions softened by the fear of exposing more. Daniel put a hand over his face, then sucked air through his teeth. She wrote about how Dad would get mean when he drank, he said. But there are lines I didn't expect. There are notes about that night. The one I remember but pushed back to the corners. There's a cassette. She recorded things. She wrote like she was trying to document so she could remember better than her memory would later remember it. Felt dizzy. The basement tilted slightly, like a ship changing tack. For years I'd kept a box of my own memories as if it were a first aid kit. Photos tucked away, songs that made me breathe, my own childhood injuries filed into narrative. But this was not my memory alone. It was a ledger with entries that accounted for both of us. Why bring it out now? I asked, the question small because I didn't want to know the answer. The why of it was a key, either opening us or locking us in. Daniel looked at me, and for the first time since we were children, he didn't look like he was attempting to perform a role for me. Because I couldn't sleep. Because sometimes you have to pound on the wall until you hear an answer. Because I wanted you to know before it disappeared with Mom's fog. His voice was tight with urgency. I wanted us to know what we were dealing with before whoever cleans out the house throws it away. He said it plainly. The hospital had given us a deadline. They'd warned us about the quickness of decline, about how loose documents can be lost in the shuffle of cleaners and new bedsheets. The shoebox held not only scribbles but a lineage of choices and errors. An explanation for why our father could be banal and then violent, a record that might have otherwise gone the way of all small things we think will anchor us but which bury themselves in dust. A long silence followed, the kind that was less empty than fulsome with meanings that hurt. I set the letter down and looked at Daniel. There was a reckoning in his face that matched my own panic. The recognition that the past is sometimes a ledger that demands payment in present currency. My mother would soon be dependent. Our roles were being rearranged into adult children who had to reconcile the records of parents who had been simultaneously victims and perpetrators. Has something like this ever happened to you? I asked softly, because this felt like a brave, practical invitation into conversation. Has anyone ever felt their family be both safe and violent? He swallowed and shook his head. All families are messy, he said. But some things are messier because someone chose them. In the basement, we sat with the shoebox between us like a landmine. I wanted to gather these pieces up and put them back where they'd been hidden. I wanted to be the person who could close the lid on the past and say we were moving on. But moving on felt like a betrayal and like cowardice at once. The presence of that shoebox seemed to demand that we choose. Either we acknowledged the ledger and paid attention to what it said, or we let it dissolve into the water of forgetfulness. I thought about my mother on the couch upstairs, fragile and independent at the same time. Someone who had survived in ways that required compromises I wasn't sure I could judge. I thought about the ways I had forgave myself for fleeing, the tiny absolutions I had allowed. Daniel's eyes found mine, and in them I saw that our childhood had been an economy of survival where some debts were paid by silence. "Don't stop," he whispered. "Tell me everything you remember. Tell me the things you pushed into the corners. I need to know I'm not alone." And so I did. I told him pieces that had been scattered across my life. Nights Dad had screamed, the time I hid a bruise beneath a sweater and told myself it was clumsiness, the song I had written that I never sang. He told me about his own memories, the flashes and fogs that had never aligned into a complete picture until those letters gave them edges. We spoke until the basement light buzzed and the house seemed to wait with us, like an audience holding its breath. At some point my phone buzzed again. It was a message from a nurse at the hospital. "Mrs. Mercer seems confused this evening. We need to know if you'd like hospice consult." I read it and felt something harden and loosen at the same time. The shoebox sat between us like an accusation and a confession. We were both accountable now, not only to the letters but to the living woman upstairs who had been part perpetrator and part protector. "If this is resonating," I said when the words finally returned to me from somewhere down the line, "a like really helps. And if you're going through anything like this, please leave a comment. I'm reading everything. It helps to know I'm not the only one." Daniel didn't laugh this time. He looked exhausted and resolute, and the sound of the furnace seemed to say that the house was no longer our child's playground, but a place that required adults who could keep its brittle architecture from falling. We agreed wordlessly that we would not let the shoebox disappear. We would catalog it, read it, and then decide whether to confront our mother with the truth. The basement, cold concrete, lit by a single bulb, had become a courtroom. It was small and imperfect, but it was real. We stepped outside for a cigarette, a habit I'd thought I'd long ago abandoned. The rain had started again, soft, steady, as if the sky couldn't decide whether to mourn or to wash. Our breaths fogged in the cold, and for the first time in decades, I felt something like partnership with my brother. It wasn't a happy thing. It was a hard, gritty alliance built on the exact injuries that had once driven us apart. We were joined by the shoebox, by the letters, by the knowledge that the past was not a private landscape but a shared map. "Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends," I said quietly, a private irony. I didn't say it to boast or to monetize pain. I said it because telling the story out loud seemed like an act of keeping the light on. We were going to be doing something hard, pulling truth out of the shadows and deciding what to do with it. The bang that had brought us into the basement had been more than noise, had been an alarm. When we went back upstairs, the house felt smaller, as if the walls had been rearranged overnight to accommodate the gravity of what we'd found. The living room smelled faintly of lavender from the candle I had lit to help my mother sleep. She was sitting up, watching the muted television, a folded blanket over her knees. Her eyes flitted to us when we entered, and for a heartbeat I saw recognition in them, then confusion, then the familiar resigned smile of someone used to being an island in a shifting sea. "Hey, are you kids okay?" she asked, which was a mother's way of wrapping worry into politeness. Her left hand trembled slightly when she reached for the remote. She didn't know the shoebox existed, and maybe that was a mercy. Maybe it wasn't. We sat in the room like two people rehearsing a script. Daniel avoided looking directly at our mother. I wanted to speak but found my voice chewing on the words. The shoebox sat at my feet like a sleeping animal. I could feel my pulse in my throat. The television screen showed images of migrating birds, small bodies against the blue expanse, while the air between us held news that could break both of us and rearrange the way we understood ourselves. "Mom," I said finally, because the silence felt like complicity. "Can we talk? Later? Privately?" She nodded. "Of course, honey." Her voice had the practiced tone of someone who'd learned how to agree with things she couldn't change. Later came faster than I expected. We moved into the kitchen, lights too bright against our tired faces, and sat at the table. Daniel pushed the shoebox across the table as if it were a living thing that could bite us if we weren't careful. My mother looked at it, and for the first time in years I saw fear register on her face in a way that was not about her memory but about something within her that remembered choices. "What is that?" she asked, the question small and precise. I heard the tremor in my voice as I answered. "It's letters. From you." Her hands folded into each other. I had those. Emily, I don't." She seemed suddenly lost, the way a swimmer might be who finds themselves in shallow water where once there had been depth to measure. Exhaled. There was no graceful intro for this moment. The truth wasn't a smooth thing wearing a ribbon. It was rough and a little jagged and required courage to pick up. "Mom," I said, and somehow felt like an old child trying to enact a new role. "We found some letters in the basement. They talk about Dad's behavior. About things that happened. I don't want to accuse you in the middle of this. I just need you to tell me what you remember." The silence that followed was full, like a cup waiting to be filled. My mother looked at Daniel and then at me. There was a sudden geometric clarity to her face, as if someone had switched on a spotlight in a room that had always been dim. She reached for the box with a hand that trembled but didn't falter. "I wrote things down," she said, voice small and brittle. I wanted to remember the truth so I wouldn't lose it later. There were times when your father, was not himself. He drank and he hurt people. I thought I could keep it from getting worse. I thought if I documented it, I could find a way to prove it to myself if nothing else. Not that I'd defend it. But, her breath hitched. There was one night. Daniel's chair scraped back. His face had changed into something fierce and small and terrified. He said nothing, but I saw him steady himself like a man preparing to run a long race. She told us, haltingly at first, about nights blurred into a sequence of incidents. She spoke of an event, an incident she described as a mistake that got out of hand, and then faltered. The kitchen clock ticked like a jury. Her voice dipped into the grammar of trying to explain a thing she had survived by claiming it as an aberration. "I was afraid," she said finally. "I was afraid of him. He would turn on me for the smallest things. I thought if I kept quiet I could keep you safe. I thought if I did not cause him more humiliation he might." She stopped, her eyes glittering with a sorrow I had, until that moment, seen only in fragments. Daniel's hand shook. He reached across the table and grabbed my mother's fingers, not tenderly, but with a kind of urgent seeking that said he was trying to find any foothold to keep from falling into a space of endless, treacherous doubt. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, the question more accusation than query, but there was also pain in it like an animal's hurt whine. "I didn't want to lose you," she said. "He said if I ever said anything he'd leave and he'd take everything. Thought staying was better. I thought." Her voice broke like thin glass. And with that fracture came a cascade. The understanding that sometimes staying is a survival instinct, not goodness, and that those who survive by making compromises are not always heroes and are rarely villain-free. We learned in a moment the difficult truth. Our mother had chosen a path that was morally ambiguous because the stakes were survival. It didn't excuse anything, nor did it absolve. It explained. The room seemed to tilt. Daniel's face was a map of something being undone. He had boxed his anger for years, but now it roared like surf, the kind that erases everything in its path. He stood up. "You let him hurt me," he said, the words both a verdict and a cry. "You let him." "Daniel," my mother whispered. It wasn't a defense. It was a plea. "I tried to stop it." "You tried to stop it by keeping it hidden," he said. "You tried to stop it by telling us later in small doses. You think you can fix it with notes. You think paper repairs bones." The kitchen felt too small. I reached for Daniel's arm and he shrugged me off, something I'd felt 1,000 times before, and yet this time felt like a fresh stab. The truth was messy. It had irregular edges, and required us to decide whether we loved the person who had made the choice to stay. Love suddenly was not a simple currency. It had to be negotiated against betrayal and protection and the practicalities of keeping a roof over our heads. There were no heroes in our room that night. There were only people, grown and raw, confronting the fact that life had made them choose imperfect tools to survive. We argued in fits and starts, the voices overlapping like broken records, until exhaustion turned the edges of all our sharpness into something dull. At some point the nurse called again to say that Mom had a bad night at the hospital, and that the discharge might not be safe without more support. The world, like a clock tower, kept its schedule while we tried to rewrite our family history. I remembered the pamphlet with the hospital logo. Words like hospice consult and care plan unrolled in my head like road signs. Make decisions here, sign here, commit here. I could see the shoebox on the kitchen table like a signpost pointing to a new country none of us had planned to visit. By the end of the night, we were shattered in different ways. Daniel returned to the basement, not in an attempt to hide but as a tactical retreat. He needed space to process, and the basement offered it. Rough, damp, a place filled with the relics of our father. Cigarette boxes, an old guitar, a dented harmonica. I sat with my mother for a long time, watching the shadows cross her face. If these details are landing with you, if the thought of discovering painful family secrets weighs on something in your chest, please leave a comment. I read everything. Sharing helps stitch the rawness into something that can be held. When morning came, the house felt like an open wound. We had to figure out what to do. The hospital's patience was finite. There were forms to fill, legalities to consider, calls to make. My mother nodded through the practicalities like a sailor tacking in rough weather. Daniel and I spoke less and carried more in our silence. The caffeinated smell of coffee filled the kitchen, and the news on the radio was about a local election, meaningless in the face of what we were untangling. The fallout of that night would be slow and jagged. We had unfastened a truth and now had to decide whether to do anything with it. The shoebox, the letters, the cassette tapes. All of it demanded something like action. To do nothing would be to let history keep its patterns. To act would mean forcing our mother and ourselves to account for a past that had been deliberately made private. We made a plan, faltering and interim. Catalog the letters, make copies. Contact a lawyer for advice. Seek a geriatric consult. Find a therapist for Daniel. Ask the hospital for time. None of it felt like enough, but it was work. Work is a way to keep the edges under control. That afternoon, as Daniel hammered at something in the basement, this time not out of panic but to build, he paused and looked up. "Don't stop," he said quietly. "Tell the story. Don't keep it to yourself." There was pleading in his voice now, less about accusation and more about not letting what happened to him become a secret again. So here I am telling it. If you've made it this far and it matters, if you feel like the truth in your house is trying to get out too, consider subscribing. It helps keep this channel alive and maybe, in a small way, help someone else have the courage to pound on their basement door until someone listens. The days after we unearthed the shoebox became work. Practical, legal, emotional. My laptop was suddenly full of appointments and tabs. Elder care services, therapists, a local legal aid office that specialized in family disputes and estates. Daniel and I made lists as if lists could build a bridge between the past and the future. We cataloged each letter, transcribed the faint handwriting, backed up the cassette tapes into files that would not disintegrate with time. My mother oscillated between moments of startling lucidity and clouds of forgetfulness. Sometimes she remembered little things, how my father used to whistle when he cooked pancakes, and at other times she stared at us like strangers had taken over her life. The batteries of caregiving drained us both. Daniel took to the night shift because it was quieter in his head then, and I handled the day doctor calls, the forms, the meetings with social workers who used terms like capacity and intervention. It felt like being coordinated by architecture rather than love. One evening a nurse from the hospital, Marissa, a woman with a voice that never quite betrayed emotion, came by for a visit. She sat across from my mother who was knitting a loop that refused to become a pattern. The presence of an outsider made everything feel clinical and real. Records existed now, their ink a sort of armor. "Mrs. Mercer," Marissa said gently, "we wanted to talk about a care plan. Right now, it looks like outpatient care with regular evaluations. Does that sound like something you'd want, with family support?" My mother looked at me, and in that look there was a sifting, She wanted permission to trade the hard truth for something more bearable. We all did. I wanted to be the one who could make the right choice, the wise child who could stitch our family back together. But the shoebox did not allow easy stitches. It had turned a private shame into a public ledger. That night, after Marissa left, my brother and I argued again. Smaller things now, but they were the threads of larger unhealed wounds. We fought about money, about who had the right to decide for our mother's care, about whether to confront neighbors with the truth or keep it within our family to protect her dignity. The arguments were always two-sided, the desire to do the right thing and the fear of what that might reveal. "You left," Daniel said suddenly mid-argument, like he was plucking at an old scar. "You left us there to drown him. You took your life and your own survival and left us to sort the wreckage. And you stayed," I shot back, my voice sharp as a shard. "You stayed and carried the memories like they were ballast. You think that was easy? You think that didn't twist you up inside? I ran so I wouldn't become him. Sorry. I'm not proud of that, but I fled and I survived." We both had the taste of blood in our mouths, as if old blows had been struck anew. Saying the things out loud didn't heal them. It exposed them to the light. A week later, we had a consultation with a social worker who looked at the shoebox and then at us. "This is evidence of a history that may be relevant to elder care decisions," she said. "But be careful with how you proceed. Accusations, however true, can complicate custody and care. You might want to consider mediation or family counseling. Also, this may be hard to hear, but there are statutes of limitations in sexual abuse cases that vary by jurisdiction." She said it clinically, but the words felt like doors closing and slamming at the same time. We decided to seek counseling anyway, for all of us. My mother, Daniel, and me. The therapist, Dr. Alvarez, had a kind tone and a practical approach. In her office I felt like we were on a stage with minimal props. I told her the story in fits and starts. Daniel filled in the blanks. My mother listened and sometimes wept and sometimes smiled as if a particularly kind thought had visited her briefly. "You all carry both victim and bystander," Dr. Alvarez said gently on one of our visits. "Your mother was a person navigating limited options. Your father was abusive. Daniel and Emily, your experiences are both unique and overlapping. Therapy isn't about blame in the legal sense necessarily. It's about unpacking the impacts. In sessions, memories came out like small animals from sewers. Hesitant, filthy, sometimes sweet, sometimes fierce. Daniel wrote down moments on loose slips of paper and then threw them away like offerings. I had nightmares, literal, sharp, cinematic, where walls closed in and I couldn't breathe. I tried to sleep and often failed. My hands hummed with insomnia. The nights filled with the sound of the old house settling. Then came the night I hadn't expected. A phone call from our mother's estranged sister, Aunt Nora, who had left the state years ago after a falling out with Dad. She was terse on the phone, the kind of voice that has turned grief into a skill set. "I heard about the hospital," she said. "About the letters." Her silence was full of accusation. "You have to be careful," she told me. "Family things eat you. They rot out foundations. Are you sure you're prepared? A family fatally divided over secrets is not rare. The difference comes in whether you decide to keep them buried." Aunt Nora's voice carried years of distance but also the kind of clarity that comes from being outside a situation. She offered to come, to read, to act as a neutral party. I don't know if neutral is possible between kin, but the offer felt like a lifeline and a threat at once. Confrontation loomed. We had to decide whether to confront our mother with the letters explicitly, to ask her to sign them as testimony or to keep them as history. There was also a practical argument to be had. If the letters were recorded and dated, they could be documentation that explained Dad's abuse in a way that would open doors for legal support or at least contextualize our decisions for caseworkers. But putting them forward could also force my mother into a reliving she might not have the strength to do. One night I sat at the kitchen table and wept. Not theatrical sobs, but the kind that are made of small, continuous grief. Daniel found me there and sat down without asking. He reached across the table and took my hand. For a moment, The two of us just held a silence that was older than both of us. We were in it together now, jagged edges and all. I don't know if doing this will help anyone, I admitted. All I know is I'm tired of secrets deciding what we are allowed to be. He nodded. Me too. His fingers were calloused in all the places where grief and work had rubbed them. I don't want another kid to come through this house and think silence is the only currency. We can't necessarily change what happened, Em. But maybe we can change the way we respond. Decision-making hardened into action. We made copies of the letters and scanned the cassette tapes into digital files. We set up secure cloud storage and told Aunt Nora to come for a weekend. We scheduled a family counseling session that included our mother, my brother, Aunt Nora, and our therapist. It felt like an intervention of sorts, like we were about to hold the past under a light to see what crawled out from the corners. The weekend that followed was the kind of weather my lungs remembered. Gray, low clouds, the kind that makes you feel like the world is whispering at a low frequency. Aunt Nora arrived with a bag full of papers, pictures, and a patience that had been honed by time and distance. She moved through the house like a librarian, sorting, asking, creating little piles of memory that were legal and sentimental by turns. My mother sat on the couch and watched us like someone who'd tuned into a program about her own life, and wasn't entirely convinced it was accurate. The family therapy session took place in the living room. Dr. Alvarez guided us through phrases and exercises that felt, at first, constructed, then suddenly wonderfully necessary. "You are here with consent," she began. "We will track feelings, not assign blame." Sounded impossible, and yet we agreed to try. The session opened like a slow sunrise. We read from the letters aloud sometimes, a practice that felt like exhumation and also like purification. When my mother read certain lines, her voice crumpled. Sometimes she laughed in a brittle way as if some relief was passing through her. The letters showed both cruelty and mercy. Nights described that made my stomach drop and sentences where she expressed regret so honest it made me ache. We held those pages as if they were objects of fragile art. When it came time to confront the more violent specifics, those direct accusations that had, until then, existed as shadows and fog, our mother surprised us. She did not deny them entirely. She spoke of memory's unreliability and the way truth can fold into itself with time. She spoke, haltingly, of the night Daniel had told us about in the shoebox, a night she had watched, paralyzed by fear and a calculation about what staying meant. "I thought if I stayed," she said, voice tiny, "I could keep you. I was selfish and I was scared. I did not know how to be brave for all of us. I was bad at being brave." We each felt something shift. Daniel's face was an amalgam of anger and relief. Some part of him had wanted the confession, however raw. My mother wept for a long time, not theatrically but as if a pressure valve had released. The admission did not heal, but it clarified. Those minutes of clarity produced the kind of decisions that are more like scaffolding than buildings. We decided, together, that our mother would not be left alone. We set up in-home care services and a schedule that included at least one of us there during the night. We contacted a lawyer for a consult about estate and power of attorney matters and asked the social worker about resources for trauma survivors in the area. We made an appointment with an elder care counselor who specialized in memory and trauma. Most importantly, Daniel and I promised each other radical honesty. No more letters hidden in shoeboxes. No more solitary suffering. We vowed to speak the truth, to document, to reach out. It was not a grand vow. It was a daily practice, a stern, quiet commitment. There would be no magic fix. There was only work. Setting boundaries, attending therapy, sometimes filing paperwork that felt like a small ritual of grown-upness. In the weeks that followed, life reoriented itself in slow orbit. Our mother settled into a new rhythm, sometimes lucid and sweet, sometimes lost but safe. We taught her new anchors. The smell of a certain tea in the morning, a playlist of songs that made her hum. Daniel started to show up for gigs again, turning chords into a way of holding on. He also met with a counselor for his own trauma and addiction issues, and I watched him rebuild his life like someone redesigning a house after a storm. There were breakdowns. There were nights when my hands shook as I collected pills into a tray and wondered how to make amends for decades of selfishness. There were days when I felt triumphant, a small domestic victory. The letters were placed in a folder and then scanned and backed up in 3 places. We gave copies to Aunt Nora and to Dr. Alvarez for safekeeping and to preserve the record. The tape was digitized, and strangely, hearing my mother's voice from years ago discussing things in the precise terms she had used gave an odd, painful clarity. It wasn't cinematic. It was practical. We learned things about our father we didn't want to learn and things about our mother we needed to understand. The arc of the story bent from secret to exposure to care. It wasn't clean. It didn't absolve anyone fully. It did, however, open space for something like repair. The banging in the basement had been more than an interruption. It had been a summons to do the work of seeing our family plainly. It had been a loud, necessary noise that made us attend to things we might otherwise have let rot. I still remember how small and terrified I was the first night as the sound echoed through the floorboards. Now, when I pass the latch to the basement door, it feels less like a trapdoor into secrets and more like an entrance to the parts of us we have to visit if we want to survive. If any of this is resonating, if you've been holding a secret or guarding a shame, please reach out. There are hotlines and community resources. Maybe start with a trusted friend. Or, if you're comfortable, leave a comment below. I'm reading everything, and sometimes the most anonymous compassion is still a kind of lifeline. The lessons of this whole thing are not tidy. Here is what I'll try to leave you with. Secrets do not protect. They shift the harm. Keeping a secret might feel like shielding someone, but it often redistributes pain to others, usually those closest. Courage doesn't always look like public confrontation. Sometimes it looks like the slow, stubborn work of showing up for appointments, reading hard letters, and learning to ask for help. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is practice. It requires boundaries and choices and sometimes the wisdom to say, "I love you, but I cannot enable your harm." Trauma is generational, but it can be interrupted. A shoebox doesn't have to decide the futures of the people who inherit it. You can choose differently. My family is not fixed. We are messy and human and still learning how to be kind in ways that are brave and true. There are days when I will think back and imagine choosing differently at 22. There are days when I look at my brother on stage and think about how therapy and honesty triangularly held us together. There are days when my mother sings a song from my childhood and the house sounds, for a moment, like home. Please subscribe, I find myself saying, because the telling matters. It matters that stories like this get told without the gloss of melodrama and with the teeth of truth. If you felt something here, anger, pain, recognition, consider sharing this story, leaving a like, and, if you're willing, comment about your own experiences. Has something like this happened to you? How did you survive? I'm reading everything. We're not alone, even when it feels like the house is too quiet. The banging in the basement was an awful sound, but it woke us. Demanded we look. What followed was not tidy justice or cinematic revenge. It was messy care, uncomfortable conversations, paperwork, therapy, and the slow building of a new ethics in our home. If there's one thing I hope you take with you from our story, it's this: listen to the noises. They are often calls, not to blame but to engage. Listen, and then decide to act in ways that honor truth and protect those still vulnerable. Thank you for listening. If you want to hear more of these stories, and how they change the people who live them, please consider subscribing and joining the conversation.